anything? Okay, brilliant. So today we're very pleased to welcome Dr. Tanya Wyatt from Northumbria University for a talk on her work with CITES. That is, does the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora protect wildlife? Dr. Wyatt is a professor of criminology at Northumbria University in Newcastle. She's a green criminologist specializing in wildlife crime and trafficking and non-human animal abuse, as well as the intersections with organized crime, corporate crime, and corruption. Her latest books is CITES Protecting Wildlife and Wildlife Trafficking, a deconstruction of the crime, the victims, and the offenders, second edition. So I'll give it over to you, Tanya.
Great, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really a delight to be here today. We were chatting before. I'm sorry I couldn't just pop on that 90-minute train up in person to come up to Edinburgh, which I always love. But thanks again for the invitation. And during the invitation, it became apparent that maybe not so many people actually know about CITES. As Andrea said, it's the Convention on International Trade of Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, this very long name that we just shortened to talk about CITES. So with that in mind, I'm going to start off with talking about why we need CITES. So what is the nature and extent of wildlife trade? And that's a global kind of overview that I'll give. And then what is CITES? So maybe you guys are all familiar with how international conventions work. And so I'm going to talk about in the legal sense how this one actually works. Then I've actually completed a study in May of 2020 that was detailing about CITES, and I'm going to talk you through the methods that I used, the findings, and then some solutions as to how we could make CITES better. That big question is does CITES protect wildlife? I think the initial answer would be only some of it, and probably not very well. So if you guys know about wildlife trade, it's obviously, well, I say obviously, but maybe that's my bias in the news that I read. This is a really hot topic in the media because of COVID, and that there are links of wildlife trade to the spread of zoonotic diseases. And you might have seen the WHO reports, so the World Health Organization in their investigation in China over the last few weeks is talking about wildlife trade is really integral in how Corona probably got started. If it wasn't wildlife trade, then it was probably wildlife farming, which I touch on in this research. So it's an important topic for lots of reasons, but one of the big reasons is around a biodiversity crisis that we are in. People call it the sixth mass extinction. And this is because the rate of human-induced extinctions is 100 to 1,000 times higher than any point in history, and non-human caused extinctions. So the natural disasters of meteors hitting the earth or those kinds of things. Humans are causing other species to go extinct at tremendously higher rates. And this is also on top of habitat loss. So that is also factoring into this. But what we shouldn't forget is that the second cause of extinction after habitat loss is overexploitation of wildlife because they're treated as a resource. And that links into poaching and illegal wildlife trade happening on this international scale. And it isn't just maybe those beautiful megafauna, as they get called, that we see in the news of the elephants and the rhinos and pandas that are targeted for wildlife trade. It's the entire web of life. And there's some really great articles out there in conservation journals that are documenting this about its invertebrates, insects, arachnids, and then birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians. So marine species, we should forget about fish. So it really is the entire web of life that we're looking at that are part of trade and consumption. And it isn't only particular countries. Unfortunately, in the news, this becomes a very racialized trade where the fingers get pointed at China or Asia in particular, but it really is the entire world that is impacted. And that is not only as source countries that have wildlife that gets traded, but also as consumers. And we really need to focus on the European Union and the United States as being huge consumers of wildlife. So it isn't just happening in other places around the world, it's definitely happening around us as well. And so the wildlife trade, what do we do about it? On a global level, in 1973, a few countries at the time decided to initiate this through the United Nations and through the World Union for Conservation of Nature, CITES. So it's the main instrument for governing trade. It came into force in 1975 with a few dozen countries, and now we're up to 183 parties that are members of CITES. And it isn't just countries, it mostly is, but the European Union as an entity is also a member. So that adds a level of complication in terms of legislation. How it works is that there is a secretariat based in Geneva. They have some staff, permanent staff that are there that are implementing this convention. It has 3 appendices, which are the places where species get listed if they have varying levels of threat to their survival only from trade. It's important to remember that this is a piece of trade legislation. It isn't a piece of environmental or wildlife law. It really is just about trade. And if a species can be sustainably traded, it's listed in Appendix 2. But if you have a trade that is threatening the survival of that species, then it gets listed in Appendix 1. And that's where we see elephants and rhinos and those ones we see in the news media where populations have obviously are approaching extinction in some cases, and that we shouldn't be trading them at all. They get listed in Appendix 1. And that's what Appendix 1 is limiting trade almost completely, except for scientific purposes. Appendix 2, you can trade those wildlife, but it has to be within certain parameters that the country has scientifically verified and justified. So it can be a very, maybe all conventions are, it's incredibly bureaucratic. And this system is monitored through a permit system that each national government actually has jurisdiction over. So the project that I was doing was looking at how are countries doing? So we've got 183 parties that are supposed to be implementing this really strict legislation around protecting species. And I should say one of the big limitations right from the start of CITES is that it only lists 38,000 species. And that might sound like a lot, but there's 8 million species on the planet. So it's a very tiny portion. And so a lot of species that are traded and probably traded to levels that are unsustainable or exploitative are not listed in CITES. So sort of from the beginning, we have some constraints. But what countries are supposed to be doing is they have 4 big elements of their national legislation that need to be in place to make CITES implemented properly and fully, and that they're required to do by becoming members of the convention. And I'll go into each of those, how countries are doing. You can see them at the bottom there. So they have to have a management and scientific authority. They have to prohibit violations. They have to penalize trade, illegal trade, I should say, and they have to confiscate illegal traded wildlife or illegally possessed wildlife. So those are the 4 criteria that all of the country's legislation is judged on. And this national legislation project that started in 1992 has gone through and periodically looked how are countries doing, and they categorize these into 3 different levels. So you can see there's 20% almost have not done anything. So they're members and there's no implementation evident. Category 2, they've got some bits in there, maybe 1 or 2 of those 4, but that's still another 25%. So it's barely just over 50% where this national legislation project, which is staff of CITES, which I think could be problematic that they're judging themselves in terms of how countries are doing. Just over 50% have actually implemented it as the convention requires. And this is a convention that is over 45 years old. So, so problematic in terms of getting countries to comply with the requirements of what they should be doing. So what I came in to do, so this project was a funded project by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, which is where law fits within the Research Council. And it is a legislative study that I completed. So the first thing I did was a content analysis of 183 members countries legislation. So that included in the EU in that though. And this took me the entire first year. I had the very great privilege of having 100% of my time devoted to this from the funding that I received. So the first step, as all good legal analysis, legal research, you have to find the legislation. So there isn't a repository of this legislation anywhere. There are some pockets of it that have been collected by other organizations. Legal Atlas, for instance, is an online database that has, I think it had about 40 or so of the legislation that I was looking for. So really just looking to find the legislation that was implementing CITES. And I don't think what I produced was complete because it's incredibly complex in terms of animals, plants, forestry, fisheries. So there's numerous pieces of legislation, and I do imagine that that's a limitation of my studies, that I didn't find everything that I could. And of course, language issues, English versions of the legislation, I found for 112. I can read Spanish and Russian, and so those I was able to read. And then Google Translate, an amazing advancement for researchers, helped me in 47 different instances. And that obviously has limitations, I think, in terms of vocabulary of what you're looking for and what you're reading. So there's that limitation as well. And then there were some that just couldn't be translated because of the file and because of the limitations of Google Translate. I'm sorry, I don't know why that keeps moving on. The second part I did though is, so I did this massive legal analysis. I have this ginormous spreadsheet that is huge of all of this information. And I was looking at those 4 elements that I mentioned in particular around the 4 criteria for the National Legislation Project. So I've got all of that together, I do an analysis, and then I decide I want to know how these different elements can be improved and what experts are thinking about how CITES is doing and how countries are doing in implementing it. So the second part of the methods is a Delphi iterative survey, it's called, and it's a very in-depth, time-consuming survey that takes participants probably around 40 minutes. It was numerous different questions, which were mostly Likert scale questions, but there was a lot of open text as well. And I did send that to well over 600 people, all of those authorities that I mentioned, the CITES scientific and management authorities received it, and then loads of charities and wildlife conservation organizations work in this sphere, so they got it as well. So I had 32 participants in the first round, but only 23 in the second round. And that's why it's an iterative survey, is after you have that first round, you see what people have answered, you see what they're asking and what questions you missed, and you go back and ask them again to clarify comments or to expand on information that came out from that first round. Part of what that led to is the identification of 3 countries that participants in that survey thought had lessons to be learned or had best practice in terms of implementing and complying with CITES. And that ended up being Canada, Indonesia, and South Africa. It could have easily been the EU, the UK, and the US, but in the CITES and wildlife trade spheres, these 3 places get talked about all the time, and there's so much information about them that I decided I wanted to look at less covered practice in countries that hadn't actually been talked about in this field. So even though I could have gone a different route, I was slightly selective in those case studies. And then I did 20 in-depth interviews with people from those countries and from experts in general about the information that had come out of that survey. And what were the specifics of those three countries, of what are they doing well, but also where have they gone wrong and what we could learn from, so that to create best practice or lessons learned for all the 183 different CITES parties. Just to be clear, so it was a project about implementation and compliance, and implementation meant our parties actually taking that international convention text and transposing it into their national legislation. That's what implementation technically means and what I was specifically looking about. Compliance then was not, do we as the public comply with CITES, but does the government of the parties, are they complying with what they said they would do by joining the convention? And in the CITES context, what that means is there are certain reporting requirements. So annually, they need to send in all of the permit numbers, all of the trade volumes, and then every other year, a biennial report is required where they're supposed to talk about, they're supposed to answer a survey from the CITES Secretariat about their own implementation and about their own actions. Those are really the core of compliance to CITES, just is basically reporting. There's a few other things, but those are the most obvious. Enforcement then is not what I was actually looking at. Enforcement is where the government goes in and makes sure that the public and organizations are actually not in violation of the terms of the convention. And that's a whole other research project that people need to do to see if CITES is actually getting enforced in the way that it should be, or at all in some cases. So I mentioned around the four components, and what they are, just briefly again, is that you have to have designate at least one management authority and one scientific authority. And the management authority is the organization in a country that deals with the permits. So they're the admin people, essentially. They're taking in permit applications, they're charging fees, they're doing just the supportive and administrative work. In the UK context, that's DEFRA, so the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. You also have to, as a requirement of the convention, have one scientific authority. And that authority, that organization, is doing all of the biological nitty-gritty research. So how are the populations of certain species in your country doing? What are their reproductive rates? How does that affect trade? That kind of information that informs whether or not a quota needs to be set. So say if you're going in this country, maybe it would be trading of peregrine falcons, for instance, are a CITES listed species in the UK. They're Appendix 2, maybe some possibly leaning to Appendix 1. Do they need to be limited in how many can actually be traded? The scientific authority gathers that data. And again, in the UK context, that the UK has opted to have more than one scientific authority. So there is the Animal and Plant Health Agency, so APHA is one. You also have the Joint Nature Council, which is part of DEFRA, but then you have Kew Gardens as well. So the Royal Botanic Garden does all of the plant and timber kinds of information. And so what I found, you can see there is a breakdown of the different authorities. So you have to have an MA, so the management authority, and an SA, the scientific authority. But some countries have opted to go even further and to have an enforcement authority, which is not required by the convention, but it is that group of people that are actually going out to the public and to organizations and making sure that they aren't violating CITES. And here, that's the Border Force and the National Wildlife Crime Unit are the agencies basically leading on that. And so you can see there's lots of different approaches to this. And what I was looking at here in particular is it a conflict of interest if you have a scientific and a management authority that are the same organization? So you have the person who's gathering the scientific data also saying, oh yeah, you can have this many permits and here's your permit. So that's why I was curious if it's the same organization or if it's a separate organization. And the participants, so the interviewees, thought that it wasn't necessarily a problem that there was an overlap as long as there was autonomy and some individual independent kind of decision making. But many countries, Canada as one of the case study countries, actually they have all of their 3 authorities sitting within the same building even, but also sitting within the same organization. The only real red flag here, I would say, is that there's some countries with no scientific authority, which means that no scientific data is supporting their trade, and this is in violation of implementation. So those countries are not properly actually implementing CITES. And reading through, doing my legislative analysis, countries with prohibition, which was really obvious. So I was looking for, clear words around, this is a violation, you're prohibited from possessing species without a permit, or trading species without a permit. And most of the cases, this is very clear. But yeah, there's quite a lot actually, that it isn't very obvious. I should say though, that it's sort of ambiguous, so they don't have explicit language prohibiting, but when you look at the next factor around penalties, it becomes clear that countries do prohibit it because they have penalties in place. So there is obviously some amount of prohibition that you can kind of surmise because of the penalties. And here we still have some blanks. Again, though, I think there's limitations to this because I imagine some countries have a penal code which will have penalties that might not be in this trade legislation that's implementing CITES. So I imagine that there are penalties for some of these countries where it looks like it's blank. When you do see penalties very obviously in the legislation, though, a majority are fines or prison, so a combination. And I think we would see this in most kind of criminal approaches. I should say, though, that there's nowhere in CITES does it say or require that the penalties have to be criminal or that the legislation has to be criminal. So it could be administrative, it could be civil. So we don't know the level of countries that are taking a criminal approach to CITES in all cases. But again, it would, the fine versus prison probably reflects the severity of the offense of an accidental kind of illegal trade. And then we have confiscation. So this tends to be an interesting one because there's this added element to wildlife trafficking of what happens if the wildlife is alive, what happens to them. And so most countries do have in their legislation that they do have the provisions to confiscate wildlife, and that might be live, but it could also be products as well. And then there are countries that are taking a more holistic approach to this and providing for the confiscation of equipment and of evidence. And there is a really big push through various organizations to have wildlife trafficking be included in Proceeds of Crime Act or money laundering, corruption, those kinds of things. So giving law enforcement all these other avenues to tackle it. But the confiscation one does raise an interesting one in the live context, as I said. And the UK does tend to get singled out as having a good approach. You guys might know that, sorry, why is that done that? That Heathrow actually has the Heathrow Animal Reception Center. So live wildlife coming into the UK should always come predominantly anyway into Heathrow Airport. And they have full-time on-staff veterinarians that are screening live wildlife that are coming through. And Border Force has a CITES dedicated unit at Heathrow that are looking for CITES permits. And if something is illegal or off or paperwork or welfare violations, there are housing facilities there at the reception center at Heathrow where the wildlife can temporarily stay, maybe sometimes too long. The visit I took back in 2012, there was a pair of ring-tailed lemurs that had been living there for 2 years. while the case went to court. Since wildlife are property in UK legislation, they couldn't be given to a rescue center or a zoo because they were the property of the person who was actually under investigation. So sadly, they lived in this closet-like facilities for far too long. And that's in a country that's doing it well. So you can imagine the kinds of consequences on a global scale of what's happening to live wildlife that's suspected as being trafficked and what happens to them. In terms of compliance, so I mentioned CITES, the big things are really just around reporting. So the annual report is a very important one because it deals with the levels and the volumes of trade. So there's a few countries that don't do that well. But the biennial report is this one that, well, from biennial you would think it's every 2 years, but it actually only happens every 3 years. And it is supposed to document how countries are doing in terms of compliance, what kinds of enforcement operations that they've put in place. Have they hired people? Do they have e-permits being trialed, for instance, which is a new kind of approach. And this is really abysmal, to be honest. So you have countries who have never done this, which is quite shocking. And clearly in violation of what they said they were going to do, but hasn't done. And so since 2003, when these reports came online, you can see that there's 7 total reports from 2003. Only 15 countries have done all of the reports over that time frame, and the UK is one of them. So you have a huge problem with compliance in terms of reporting in the CITES context. I mentioned around countries not doing their annual reports. So 3 countries have temporary trade suspensions for not doing those. And this is an interesting thing about CITES and why many people say that it is stronger than other international conventions is because it does have some teeth. If you are a country that is in violation of implementation or compliance, so if you're non-compliant, you can be subjected to these trade suspensions that would be introduced by, well, through the Secretariat, but the Secretariat has a committee structure that would deal with this. And maybe it's not just on annual reporting level. I mentioned that there's a few other things that are required, and one of these is reviews of significant trade. So a country's scientific authority, if there's a species that's particularly in trouble, they need to do this really in-depth study about how much trade is happening and how much trade should be happening. And in 18 instances, countries have temporary suspensions on that specific species because they haven't gone through this process. And these, to get to a trade suspension takes absolutely years. It isn't a thing that CITES jumps to right away. There's a lot of negotiation and compromising that goes on behind the scenes. And so to get to a trade suspension, there have been years and years of non-compliance. And CITES does understand that for some countries with very limited resources and very limited staff, these can be difficult things or expensive things to undertake. So that's partly why they do take a pretty, well, an approach that takes longer in trying to get parties on board and that they aren't just immediately quite punitive, which does make sense in a lot of different cases. So given that sort of whirlwind overview of the state of the criteria, of those 4 criteria, I came up with some recommendations around implementation. And part of that is around a real concerted effort to get members with a scientific authority. So it's nearly there. There's 5 without, but there should be efforts to get them on board as well. And there should be a consideration of adding an enforcement authority to the convention, which has had some discussion, but such a big part of CITES is making sure that there aren't violations. And if you don't have an enforcement authority, how are you making sure that the convention actually isn't being violated? In terms of prohibition, an interesting dynamic that came out in the answers to the Delphi iterative survey, but also to my interviews as well, was that often, even if you have a country where they clearly prohibit violations of the convention, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing that for non-native species. And Thailand, for instance, was one that was pointed out numerous times where this is happening, where they're very protective of their own native species, but if it's a non-native CITES species, it isn't given the same protection as the native species. So there was really a point made about not having this duality between native versus non-native. Another part of that too was around giving equal coverage and protection to terrestrial wildlife and marine wildlife. And marine wildlife was pointed out as being ignored. And if you look at the listings of the different species in CITES, you will notice that, oh, I don't know what happened there. You'll notice that fish often get left off. I don't know why my screen stopped sharing. Can you guys see it still?
No,
Oh,
just try doing it again.
Can you guys see that?
It's technology.
I think it's going now. So marine species,
yes.
And if anybody has been watching Seaspiracy in the last weeks, you'll know that they often get ignored, and they don't actually talk about CITES in that show at all, which is interesting, but right, because marine species don't always get listed on CITES, even though they are exploited. There's some really big movement around penalties. So the organization Global Initiative to End Wildlife Crime is trying to introduce to the United Nations through their transnational organized crime convention to have wildlife trafficking added as one of the protocols. So currently, and maybe you guys know, the protocols are around human smuggling, human trafficking, and illicit firearms trade. So the proposal is, let's have a fourth protocol and have it be about wildlife. This means it would have to be considered a serious crime by everyone who's a member. And there's more members in the UNTAC than there is in CITES, of over 190, that you'd have to have a possible 4-year prison sentence, which sort of standardizes it across the globe and tries to at least set the normative message that this is a serious kind of crime that's being committed. And then I mentioned around further research around enforcement. If anyone's looking for a project, there really should be an audit about the penalties. So what are those fines? What are those prison sentences across the different members? And are they getting used is the really big question. Because as we see in all crime, you guys will know as well as I do that you see this huge attrition of arrests, court prosecutions, and then sentencing or conviction. So we think many people suspect this is even greater for environmental and wildlife crimes than it is in other spheres. And yeah, and around confiscation, there are some really good guidelines out there about what to do with live wildlife in particular when you find it, that are produced by the International Foundation for Animal Welfare and the IUCN. So parties should be taking those on board much more seriously because it does have issues. And just in general, we need to be talking a lot more about welfare in all of this. It's nearly ignored completely. But even, in the context of corona and zoonotic diseases, if animals and wildlife had better welfare while they were being traded, this improves hygiene, improves stress levels and things. So it does have a larger impact than just on the individual wildlife, which I would argue is important, but it also has a lot of links to public health too. And in terms of compliance, more support to get these reports completed, and CITES being a bit stricter about it, trying to cut down on it taking years to get countries to a sanctioning point when we need to try to get them to actually just comply. And part of the recommendation was about being more open and transparent about who's complying and who's not complying. CITES has a really good website, and you can kind of pick through there and find out who's compliant or non-compliant. But to make that more visible could have some good effects as well. And then stricter enforcement around these, I mentioned the reviews of significant trade, and there's also these other issues around that get called non-detriment findings, which is if you are trading, you should be able to prove that it's sustainable, and countries aren't doing that either. And so not only can the Secretariat require that, but I thought a great suggestion from my participants was that the importing countries, so the parties, should be policing themselves. So if you're the UK and you're taking an import in from somewhere where you know they don't have good science behind their decisions, you should be demanding that they provide you with the evidence to actually be able to import it. So some more peer-to-peer kind of compliance gauging was I thought was one of the good recommendations that my participants shared with me. The book covering all of this and more is coming out in June. There's the picture of what it will eventually look like, but I would be more than happy to take any questions. And yeah, thanks so much for coming. A great number in the audience. I'm quite pleased, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. That was really interesting, and I'll be very curious to read more particularly about penalties, which you talked a little bit about. I mean, I'll pass it over to MJ for questions.
Yes, thank you, Tanya. That was great. And I also look forward to reading your book. Yes, so if you have questions, members of the audience, you're very welcome to raise your hand and unmute and show your video if you want and ask the questions, or post them in the chat box as well, and I will read them out. So raise your hands if you want to ask them out loud. But for now, oh yeah, we got Daniel. You're muted.
Sorry, I thought I'd break the ice. I didn't know that you were gonna start reading a question from the chat, so sorry about that. Thanks for the presentation, Tanya. Very, very interesting. And I was kind of interested if you want to expand a bit on the fish side. I know you're not surprised. Because so one of the questions that I think is interesting, and I think you also looked at that, is that fish is not considered wildlife in all jurisdictions. And another sort of, once you get into fisheries, and we've discussed that a little bit in the context of the fourth protocol, there's also some sort of limits to what is possible in terms of penalization. So for example, UNCLOS places limits on corporal punishment for coastal states for IUU violations. So I just be curious on your views if CITES, where the limits to the usefulness are, or if it's just something that needs to be streamlined more throughout the convention. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so Daniel and I know each other, so he's asking me something he knows I've been working on. So part of what came out of the research as well, which one of my PhD students helped me with, is in looking at that legislative analysis. Oh, and there's Kim too. He also helped with this. That if you look through the legislation, when countries say wildlife, they don't necessarily mean this entire web that I was speaking of. Often it can be very specific and only mean terrestrial animals. Sometimes it doesn't even include plants, and sometimes, yes, it doesn't include fish. And there could well be separate fisheries legislation that would deal with that. But it's interesting that, yeah, we found, and we're still trying to get published a comment about that in a law review, that fish are often ignored, or not even technically defined legally as wildlife, which creates problems. In terms of the penalties, that's interesting. Yeah, I think law of the sea and so Daniel said IUU, so the illegal unregulated, unreported kinds of fishing that's going on. Yeah, I think that has a whole other dimension of wildlife trade that is complicated in terms of the penalties. And even though I see the benefit of adding a fourth protocol because it expands CITES. So I mentioned CITES is only 38,000 species, and the UNTAC goes for would cover the 8 million, because it would make it anything illegal in the country where it happened. So countries who want to protect more wildlife than CITES could do so under that mechanism, which I think is a real strength of it. I have to say, though, as a critical criminologist, I am very skeptical of harsh penalties in general. I don't think that they are particularly effective. I think we've seen, decades of evidence of that from the drug war, supposedly, about what happens when we are incredibly punitive to people that are doing this. So I can see the benefit of the UNTAC, but I am still skeptical that we should be making everything so serious that it's going to require 4 years in prison, because prison, I don't know that anyone's doing that well either, that is incredibly brutalizing and problematic. So that's a whole other tangent, maybe.
Thank you, Daniel, for your question. And so I'll go and alternate to the chat now for a question. Marilyn says, given all the non-compliance seen, I'm wondering what the incentive is for countries/parties to even join/remain in CITES. And has it happened that a party has actually left or been kicked out of CITES?
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. Not that I know of. I don't think there's definitely been some longer suspensions for non-compliance, but no one's been kicked out. There's always, my understanding, after, so it's supposed to be every 2 years, but every 3 years there's a big conference of the parties. And after the last one that was just in August of 2019, there were several Southern African countries who threatened to leave because they're so frustrated. And that has a lot to do with, and I didn't get into this, and if you're interested in this dynamic, I would suggest reading my book, not to be too arrogant, but I talk about this tension at CITES about protectionism versus utilization. So there's a lot of countries that want stricter protections and think we should be doing less trade and thinking more about welfare. And then there's a portion of countries that are saying wildlife are a resource, we need to be utilizing them, sustainable use, and that's a real conflict within CITES. And so there are some countries that have threatened to leave over the perception that CITES is becoming more protectionist rather than being about trade. If they do is another story. They haven't yet, but that's definitely part of it. In terms of incentive to join, so if you're not a CITES party, you would struggle to trade the species that are listed, because countries that are in it need the permit, and if you're not in it and you don't have the permit, so there are those just kinds of incentives that if you want to participate, you have to be following the sort of protocol that's been accepted globally. So yeah, other than that, I think you're right with the lack of compliance. But of course, you can just join and then not comply, right? No, so you shouldn't be, but we do see that happening too.
Thank you, Marilyn, for your question. I think next we got Roger's got his hand up.
Thank you. I'm sorry I'm not allowing you to see my picture, but I'm suboptimally dressed at the moment. I'm aware that COP26 is coming along in November, and I've been trying to persuade people to write to their democratic representatives to express their views on that, because obviously MPs and senators and so forth don't know what people's views are unless they tell them what their views are. But I'm just wondering whether COP26 has a role to play in strengthening CITES.
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I think you make a great point about the interconnectedness of all the environmental international kinds of conventions. And I know that CITES does have a lot of collaborations with Convention on Biodiversity, for instance. And I think there are more moves to get involved in kind of the climate change discussions, because clearly the two can be interlinked. Of if some species are suffering or threatened because of climate change, then that's going to impact trade and trade levels. So there are clearly connections there. I don't know that CITES has any kind of representation at the CIO, but maybe other people might know the answer to that question. But I agree with you, Roger. I see that there should be links there, but I'm not sure that there's anything formal that's going on.
Thank you. I'll just post an item on the chat about COP26, if that's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. I think next we got Kim's got his hand up.
Hopefully you can hear me. I'm sitting in a car in the mountains in Italy, so I'm not sure this is going to work. But my question to Tanya is that we've got an amazing sort of vehicle in CITES, and many donors and countries are quite liberal with buying the fuel for that vehicle, which is, you know, putting the species onto the list. But not many people want to fix up the tires or, you know, deal with the state of the car. And I just wondered if Tanya could give advice to donors where maybe one or two areas they could invest to make CITES work better, rather than to put more and more money into listing new species for the appendices of CITES. Thank you.
Kim, I'm jealous. That sounds like a nice place to be. I would say that, yeah, so I should have said one of the big inspirations for me to do the study in the first place was that if you look at these Conference of the Parties that I mentioned that happen every 3 years, hundreds, if not thousands of more species get added. So that's what Kim was referring to there, is about the species listings, is that if we were doing a good job in controlling trade and sustainable trade, there wouldn't be any more listings. But every 3 years, we just see the number going up and up. So I think in terms of donors, so CITES is already struggling for funding, that technically all of the parties are supposed to contribute a certain portion, and there's a spreadsheet on their website that shows the proportion that they should be, each party should be contributing in, which is obviously really limited and doesn't always happen. So CITES is reliant on donors to pay for projects and things. And I think that the National Legislation Project is well overdue for being completely revamped and redone. So it only looks at those 4 criteria and in very narrow ways. So it doesn't explore marine so much, or non-native species coverage as just one small example. So I would think a good use would be to make the National Legislation Project look much different, and to have it be independent and come in and do a really thorough analysis. And that way you could get a much more detailed look of how it could be improved. So I think that would be one thing to do.
Thank you, Kim. There's a number of questions in the chat, so I'll read some of them out to you, Tanya. Veronica says, thank you for your great presentation. I'm wondering how, as an international law student, I could get involved. I feel like there are so many gaps and so much to do regarding illegal wildlife trade, and I would love to somehow get involved. Where to start? Thank you.
Yeah, always good. So there's, I mean, I mentioned loads of research gaps that could be filled. So as students, anybody can kind of help to start filling those. That's certainly one way to contribute. There's also a lot of great organizations out there where you can volunteer. Sea Shepherd, Trafficked, WWF, IFAW, WCS. Like there's a lot of organizations out there. CITES has an internship program as well. That, I mean, while competitive, it'd be certainly worth exploring. But I think those are some great organizations to get involved with. And I wouldn't also, and I've just mentioned some big international ones, I think I'd also encourage the more grassroots local kinds of organizations that, you know, you guys might have seen in The Guardian just the other day. So the UK is supposedly this nation of animal lovers and nature lovers, but it's one of the most depleted sites of nature in the world that David Attenborough was talking about. So I think really local, if you're in the UK, so a local kind of project is good, and projects around rewilding and things like that I think are really valuable in this context too. So yeah, but yeah, if you'd ever want to get in touch too, hopefully my email is somewhere where you guys can see it, and we could always chat more about that.
Sorry, my microphone wouldn't unmute. Yeah, I think that's great advice, Tanya. If you're very welcome to post your email in the chat for people if you want. But going on from Veronica, Marilyn again is wondering what your thoughts are on the role and success of public engagement, education, and awareness done within parties' countries.
Yeah, no, I think that comes up again and again, Marilyn, that the education is probably not where we need it to be in terms of, and I think we see again this with the pandemic about, you know, humans' relationship to nature and what does that look like, and what should that look like, and how can we make that better? And I've done lots of other, you know, environmental projects around littering and pollution and stuff. And at least in the UK, I would say there isn't enough about an environmental education from a very young age. And I think a big part of that is our relationship to wildlife. And there isn't any provisions in CITES about that. And I think that's another real strength of the fourth protocol that I mentioned to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime, is that part of what that would ask countries to do or require countries to do is to have demand reduction schemes. And I think that is really, really key. It's part of, in the wildlife trade context, what we need to do is stop consuming so much wildlife, and we need to have demand reduction. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, I think that really needs to focus on the West. It's Europe and the US that need to be doing a lot of that isn't happening.
Thank you. Next question we have from Mercedes. She says, when a species is listed in Appendix 2, how are specific trade limitations, for example, trading quota, determined by the state parties? Thank you. And yeah, and she's sorry if she's already missed this, if you've already said it.
Oh, no, but yeah, no, that's no problem, Mercedes. So yeah, the scientific authority of a party would undertake a real, hopefully, in-depth kind of population census, you know the reproduction rates of species, any kinds of those biological factors that are relevant to the survival of the species, combining that with known history of trade. So how much trade has happened in the past, how much demand that they think they are. And so, I mean, it sounds scientific, but I can't help but thinking that there's a fair amount of guesswork to that, or it's estimations, right? About how much a population can actually support, a wildlife population can support in terms of trade. So those scientists would make those decisions. And CITES is supposed to take a precautionary kind of principle, that it isn't meant to, you know, threaten any survival of any species. So it should be a precautionary kind of approach where, you know, probably less is better, but we don't necessarily see that happening. So that is the process that is left to the states, which I can see, you know, could be problematic. And I see Chris is asking, you know, about some of the best practices. It just, that kind of links in with maybe a lesson learned. It didn't look very flattering, but Indonesia, people criticized them for that the people that are exporters and traders of wildlife have a really undue influence over those quotas. And so that was a lesson to be learned, that you have to really have an independent process when you're setting those quotas, and not have people that have a vested interest having a say.
Great, thank you. Mercedes says thank you. Does anyone have any other questions? We've got around 3 minutes left. You're welcome to raise your hand or post it in the chat. Oh, I think we have. Oh yeah, Lenore asks, lessons learned from Canada.
Yeah, thanks, Lenore. So that's one article that I did actually publish specifically about it. So it's in the Liverpool Law Review, is just about the best practice out of Canada. And yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed that bit of it, because I think Canada does get overlooked in the global kind of scheme of things. But they have legislation that makes it a crime in Canada if it was a crime in the country where it happened. So say if South Africa protects a particular species and it's not a CITES species, and it ends up being in Canada, Canada's legislation also views that as a crime. And that's a real strength, so that they can help countries or support countries where they're having exploitative practices on their native species that are coming into Canada. But I think what Canada does particularly well is, and other countries are doing this too, is about specializing in wildlife law enforcement. So wildlife law enforcement isn't left to police to try to learn something new on top of all of their other duties, that they have dedicated units that are just wildlife. And that is CITES, but it's also, you know, national protections in Canada as well. And that makes a real difference, because it's a complicated area that needs a lot of specialist knowledge. And so when you have officers that are trained in that really seems to have a good impact. I mean, Canada does maybe have it a bit slightly easy in that they don't have a tremendous amount of native wildlife that are listed in CITES, and they don't have a lot of demand necessarily. So the volumes that they're dealing with are much less than in other countries. But I think Canada also does a tremendous job of getting involved globally. So they're involved in the Interpol Wildlife Crime Specialist Group. They send a good contingent that are very well prepared to the CITES conferences, to where they know about the listings. And I think a big takeaway from Canada and for is really a good kind of model that they've had to adopt over the years, is in having a community consultation and having Indigenous people, First Nations people, local communities involved in a lot of the decision making as a requirement of how their consultation process works. And that really needs to happen everywhere.
We're at the hour, but I'm going to take one last question from Roger. If people need to leave, you're very welcome to leave, and thank you very much for attending. But yes, Roger, what's your question?
Yeah, thank you. You've suggested that the UK does pretty well in this regard. Apart from doing something about keeping animals for 2 years at Heathrow, what might we do even better?
Yeah, so I mean, even the UK, which does it well, could look more internally and resource more internally. So the UK has a great global reputation of funding projects in other countries, but we should really be having a demand reduction campaign here. There's a lot of wildlife coming in here in terms of companion animals, in particular, people wanting reptiles and birds and whatsoever as pets that could be tackled. I think that's it. Glass eels are a problem for the UK as well, which are becoming a more global international issue. So some collaboration in that regard. And then not really a CITES issues, but the badger cull is a problem, I think, in the UK, where you have tens of thousands of badgers being killed. And yeah, so I think in terms of wildlife, that's not necessarily CITES related, but yeah, I think demand reduction in the UK in particular, though.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the talk.
Oh, thanks for attending. Lenore, if you wanted to email me, I could send you the article.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you everyone for attending. It's been a great presentation. What do you think, Andrea?
Yes, I think it was brilliant, and thank you everyone for coming, everyone for your questions, and most especially Tanya for speaking to us today.
Oh, thanks again for the invitation. I hope I haven't wittered on too much. So thanks.